Okay. Ooh, there it goes. Sorry. So what I was saying is about an article that we read from the Children's Bureau, and what it's showing is that kids are being reunified with their parents at a lower rate than they have in history. So in 2017, it fell below 50%, so 50%, less than 50% of kids who exited care went home with their families. And in 2019, it was 47%. So we really have some work to do, right? Because that's an important piece of what we do. And in addition, and this is especially important for Missouri Alliance because of a lot of the population that we serve, our older youth, over 20,000 kids aged out of care, which again was a growing number. And so they're aging out of care because really we're not making those connections. We're not giving them the families that they deserve to be able to move into and to be with. So I think those numbers really reinforce the work. So I thought it was kind of timely information. I think the current pandemic, too, really reinforces this, is that too many of our kids and youth are really without the connections, and they're suffering. And what we've seen is we've seen some states really delay kids exiting as they turn 21 and keeping them in the system longer. And again, what that tells us is that's great that the system is there to support them, but what it tells me is that we really haven't done the work that we needed to do to connect them to the families and into their communities so they could be successful at that time. And then again, during this time, I think we've been reminded of the inequities that we see in the outcomes for our kids and families. And so we were taking a look at our specialized program about the data, and we do see inequities. We see inequities in the length of stay that kids are in care and in different placements. And so what we know is that by working with their families, it helps them have improved outcomes, and I think that's an important piece of the work we do as well. So we're super excited again to really embrace this family finding model, figure out how we can continue to learn and improve, and certainly we know that there's no doubt how important it is to have efforts for finding, engaging, and partnering and supporting our families so that they have the ability to take care of their kids. And definitely it's important to do that within a system that is safe and developed to help them thrive and be successful. So I want to thank everybody for being here. I'm so excited about this opportunity to learn more. I have a little preview. We were able to talk with Kevin, and he gave us a little bit of preview about what we're going to hear, and so I think it's going to be really exciting. I think we're going to pick up some things that we didn't know, certainly on the cutting edge of research, so we're learning things on a regular basis, and so really appreciate you being able to share that with us. And certainly, I don't know that there's another person that maybe has the same level of passion that you have for this work, and so we're looking forward to being inspired too. And then for all of the partners that are here, all of our agencies for really partnering with us and learning alongside of us. And then we also have another special guest with us for this morning, and that's David Wood. And David Wood is the Children's Division Director, and he was appointed in June. And so David has a passion for kids and families too, and really has dedicated his life to that as an educator and as a legislator, and now as the leader of our child welfare system. And so we really feel like this is a collaborative effort. It's not something that just Missouri Alliance does, but this is something that our system can do together. And so we really felt like it was important to invite David to hear this morning's session and also say a few words. So.
Thank you very much, Carrie. And first, let me say thank you to all of you that are working in children's care and in children's welfare. That is a mission. It is not driven by money. It's driven by a passion for families. It's driven by a love for children. You don't do it for any kind of glory, that's for sure. And I do appreciate the work that you all do. I also appreciate Missouri Alliance. We have got a symbiotic relationship, I hope, that we can work together and have the benefit of children come out in the state of Missouri better off than they were. As I was driving down this morning, you know, I figured Carrie was going to ask me to speak for at least a little bit, and you always wonder, what are you going to say to a group? And it's such strange times that we're in right now. And I look up and I see demands, big changes for child protection, and a new bedrock. What's that new bedrock going to look like after we come from a pandemic? We have a choice that we can make every day. We can see the positive or we can see the negative. So I'm thinking, okay, I don't have an office open in the state of Missouri. I have a few clericals showing up. I do not have my caseworkers going into an office anymore. How is that good? Well, it has forced us to learn how we can work from home. We've moved computers, we've moved connections, we've set up virtual visits with children, trying to deal with this pandemic the best that we possibly can and keeping children safe. Now, coming out of the pandemic, some of those practices are going to stay because they've worked extremely well. We've helped keep families together. We've helped have our caseworkers be at home with their children when they were moved to virtual teaching. And we really haven't seen a huge drop in the amount of work that's actually being done. So we take the best practices and we look at what our challenges have been, and we move that to our new practices coming to our new bedrock. We have budget cuts, so we end up doing a reduction in force. There's 96 less positions in Children's Division than there was at the 1st of July. Not the easiest thing in the world to do. We tried to do this in a thoughtful way and protect our caseworkers because they're the ones actually in the field seeing the children. So you look at management, you look at different ways you can adjust, take things, move them around. But it also lets us examine where we're doing what programs, which ones are working, which ones can be prioritized. And we've used the phrase recently, getting back to the basics. Because the one thing we do not want to hurt is the protection of a child in danger. We want to make sure that every child that comes into our care is safe. Or we get a hotline call. We have normally 150,000 hotline calls. That has dropped drastically. Now that schools are kind of coming back, we're getting some of those calls coming back in. We're going to see some really bad cases coming up. We know that. And we've been preparing for that. We've been dropping our overdues. We're getting everybody caught up. We're getting our staff trained. We're doing what we need to do to get prepared for this oncoming number. So that has helped us by having this lull get us prepared in our staff and make sure that we're getting to the right places. It's evaluated our programs to make sure we're doing things efficiently as possible, and we're putting our priorities where they need to be to make sure those children are safe. You stop and look and you say, we got 14,000 children in the care of the state of Missouri. So you could have a choice of saying, wow, that's way too many. We need to do a better job of getting these children out of care. I'm going to say that's 14,000 children that are in a safer place today than they were yesterday. Because we wouldn't have them in our care if they weren't in danger. So if we're providing a safe place, whether it's through foster care, through residential treatment, through diversions, through family FCS, getting them services to make them a more stable family, we're doing our job. So I'm not concerned about a number of 14,000. I would prefer to have prevention in place, do more expansion on home visiting to try and prevent them from coming into care, from having the hotlines, and we're working towards that. But for right now, our main goal is making sure children are safe. And that's the work that you do. That's what you help us do. So thank you very much for that, because that is a priority we cannot ignore. Thank you.
All right, thank you for those words. And we certainly look forward to continuing our valuable partnership. And so one last thank you and to Carrie Scott Rourke and to Julie Lester, because they really have worked hard to put this event together. It takes a lot of work behind the scenes to coordinate an effort like this, especially during a pandemic where we have to put in all kinds of extra precautions, right? So thank you so much. Thanks for all the work you've done with Kevin to make this a great event. Okay, Kevin, I think we're ready for the, oh. I think we're ready for the main event. So again, thank you for being here, and I look forward to spending the next couple of days together.
Thanks so much. Thank you. Well, thank you very much. Good morning. It's good to be here from Seattle. I see the smoke from the fires followed me. It's a beautiful sunset last night. It was nice to be able to see one. It's been, we haven't been able to see them for a few days at home. Let me just log on so I can follow along with the slides. Okay. All right. Well, as you had heard, and some of you know, I did have the opportunity. I was invited. It was 10 or 15 years ago. I can't remember either. To visit Missouri, and we actually did. It was part of research I was doing at the time, so it's probably closer to 15 years ago. So I had just a quick catch up there for those of you as it relates to my work around family finding. My work that became known as family finding started in about 1999 in the Seattle area, working with with Catholic Community Services of Western Washington, which is the largest Catholic social service agency west of the Mississippi in the United States, where it's from the Canadian border to the California border on the west side of the mountains. And it is an organization that has an interesting connection to setting federal policy in the United States around child welfare. That particular archdiocese created models that are still used and supported in federal policy, one of which, the oldest of which was created in 1973, something called Home Builders, was created by this agency, and then about a decade later, they developed something that became known as Family Preservation Services, and then sometime after that collaborated in the creation of something called Intensive Family Preservation Services. And by the late 1980s, they were early adopters of something called wraparound. All of these things I'm sure you're familiar with. I was invited, recruited to come and help them with the challenge they were having in the mid-1990s. And the problem they were having was that they had taken on a contract as a lead agency that included providing foster homes placements for hard-to-place teenagers, and they were struggling with their ability to recruit foster parents crazy enough to foster teenagers. And I had been one of those foster parents. I had teenagers in my house, and I also had a day job, and I had developed a reputation for having a superpower for recruiting foster homes. I got famous once. In a 90-day period, we recruited and licensed 300 beds in 90 days. There were about 7 of us across the state. In addition, we opened 13 residential programs during the same time. And so the state asked me to come and help them, or they were going to take their contract away, and so I did. And you've heard this your whole life. Maybe you've said it, and I found out the limits of this statement. Everyone wants to work themselves out of a job. Have you heard that one? It's pretty cool until you do it, and then it's really anxiety-producing. And it took me about 6 months to recruit all the families that the Catholics needed, and I was looking at unemployment coming fast on me. And I needed to find a way to make myself useful. And I'm working in this agency that has a storied history of doing these family-based interventions up to the point of doing wraparound. And I'm sure you're familiar with wraparound, and you know the idea is the idea of what we call informal supports, right? We want to build a team. We want 51% of the people there to be informal supports and 49% to be professional. But I'm going to wraparound meetings, and I'm seeing a lonely parent and her teenager sitting there with a room full of paid providers and volunteers over and over again. And we call this a child and family team meeting. Around that same time, if you've been around the industry, you would know that in the late 90s, we had something called the Adoption Safe Families Act that became passed into law. And we had begun to focus our attention as a system on 3 outcome areas you know well: safety, well-being, permanency. But as you know, primarily on safety and on permanency. We had a pretty shallow idea of what well-being was. You needed to be enrolled in school, you needed a therapist, you needed a GP and you needed to get to the dentist, right? We need to meet those bare minimums for Title 19. So what was happening at the time was that I could see that we had these often, and by the way, sometimes with foster care, just a teenager and no family there at all, but a lot of professionals, and sometimes for a decade or more. And I was really struck, having been a foster parent for teenagers, as during that period of time, I was really struck by what we were beginning to learn were the outcomes for these older teenagers that you all know so well. You spoke today about the number of aging out young people having increased in the last year. We were just beginning to learn that at the time. You know, we didn't really know what happened to older teenagers who left our system until they came back as the parent of our next kid. But the research began to really shine a light on this. And so my original research was, I didn't approach the situation of older teenagers aging out without permanency with the idea that there was a solution that I could bring. I actually came to it with 3 questions. And when I came to Missouri, I was still working on those 3 questions. Here were the 3 questions. I learned this, my first job in child welfare was an awake overnight person in a group home. I don't know how many of you had that job. That job blows, by the way. About the 5th time you get the same kid off the roof of the building in the middle of the night, it's not so fun anymore. But I wasn't on that job more than 2 weeks before I learned the first lesson in child welfare that defined my career, which was this kid's got nobody, which we still hear too often said about young people, and sometimes about parents too. This parent's got nobody. And so when I got a chance to really confront this working with the Catholics and try to keep employed there after ticking the box on the foster homes, I set out to do research around 3 questions. Is it really true that the longest waiting young people in Washington state system have nobody? Was the first question. The second question was about caseworkers, and that was the second lesson you learn about state caseworkers, particularly, is they've got no time. It's an incredibly demanding job. I have to tell you, I know as Missouri Alliance members that you work in partnership with the state, but I want to acknowledge the state staff, because my experience is that if you ever want to learn something about unconditional care, meaning you never get to give up, then you be one of them, because they don't get to give up. Whatever that kid does, whatever happens to that kid, you don't get to give up. You don't get to call the state and have them come get them. They're not going anywhere. They're going to be your new best friend for the week until they find a bed for them. And no matter what happens, you're on the ride, you're on the ride with them. And I've always respected that kind of public service approach. And I don't mean to disrespect in any way your work, but I just want to acknowledge that work, because I think it's a really important job, and I think the people that do it deserve a lot of respect for it. Anyway, the second question was about them. We have a state-run system in Washington, and so I knew them well. And my second question is it, so the first question is it really true this kid's got no one? The second question is, can an overburdened caseworker find a few minutes somewhere? If in fact this kid has somebody or could have somebody, could that overburdened worker take those few minutes and could they make it work? Could we connect kids to somebody, right? Maybe that. And the third question was the social justice question, probably to me the biggest one of all, which is if it turned out that these kids in fact had somebody or could have somebody, and that you could teach these overburdened staff to take those minutes they could find and connect kids to those folks. The third question had to be answered, and that is, are the people that we would find, are they going to be safe? And are they going to be willing to help? These were really important questions. And I spent 10 years on those 3 questions. We looked at over 50,000 young people in North America, in 40 of the states, and then later in provinces in Canada. And the role that I took, just like when I came here, was to be a coach. I wasn't going to go out and find the answers. What I was going to do was work with state staff and with provider staff and foster parents and guardian ad litems and CASA volunteers and probation officers, anyone I could find, and who had kids they were worried for. And I would coach them around those 3 questions, and we would see what the answers are. And the long story short of this over that decade was what we learned. We spent, thank you, by the way, for the public investment. We spent $100 million on research, mostly from philanthropic organizations and taxpayers. And what we learned was that for 94% of America's longest waiting kids, to get into our early studies, you had to be in care at least 10 years. The longest waiting were 23 years in care. They were from Massachusetts, from Illinois, and from the District of Columbia, the 3 states that extended care to age 23, a decade before the other states were talking about extending care to 21. And so we got large cohorts of kids who were removed at the peak of the crack cocaine epidemic in those big cities, and were removed in the hospital after their mothers gave birth to them, and then lived their entire 23 years of life without ever knowing their mothers or who their fathers were, and drifted in care, and then became aged out on their 23rd birthday. And here's the story of that. The story is for 94% of these young people, their caseworkers not only found 1 adult for them, but on average found 5 to 8 adults who said that they would make a permanent, lifelong commitment to a relationship with them. They didn't say they would parent them. They said they would offer a relationship. It's very rare in social science research to have such a high rate of, an impact of 94%, which is almost universal. By 2008, because the research that I was doing got a lot of attention, it ended up getting attention in the United States Congress, as you may know, and was passed as part of the omnibus in the Fostering Connections bill that was passed in October of 2007 and then became effective in 2008 and was signed into law by President Bush. That was sort of the background story. To be really clear, what I was interested in was not creating a model that had a promise of emptying the American foster care system. I was interested in the social justice questions that I talked to you about, and I have remained interested in those questions, not those 3 questions, but asking questions as a researcher. And to set the stage for what I want to do with you today is to talk about, after we learned that for 94% of the longest waiting young people in care, we could find 5 to 8 adults in a few hours usually who would make that commitment. We learned something else in that research, and that was what you don't want to be. I got a family finder right here. How many others are here in the room? Have that family finder? Oh, you're like sitting like a gang in the second row there. We learned what you don't want to be when you're a family finder. And what you don't want to be is a dog that chases cars. Have you ever seen a dog chasing a pickup truck down the road or a car and ask yourself what that dog hoped to do with it when he caught it? And what we saw in child welfare in this science that was done by Child Trends and many other organizations who did research was almost inevitably what happened with family finding as it met child protection practice was that we saw that we could almost always catch the dog and almost never knew what to do with it. There was a conflict between finding multiple relatives and bringing them to the table, and then what would play out in terms of evolved public policy. If you think about what permanency is, the permanency as an outcome is to get a parent or get 2 parents who meet a standard and will make a commitment to a child and become their legal parent, right? By definition, that's what we call an exclusionary practice, right? If you start with, this would be really expansive. If we start with 8 billion people on the planet, what we're looking for is 1 or maybe 2 who will become their parents. So what do you do with the rest of these people? Well, child welfare has answers for that. We run background checks, and we can get you out that way. We do home studies, you're out. Think of the language here, we'll talk more about this tomorrow. Exclusionary practices based in government power was what we had evolved to. And so we end up with an inherent conflict between what we were trying to answer in terms of research questions for family finding and its real impact in terms of everyday social work practice in child protection. They weren't made for each other. In fact, they were made in spite of each other, in a sense, right? With starting places, this kid's got nobody. Really? Here's 8 people. But the truth is, we only need one of them. So 7 of them got to go. Do you see what I mean? There's a conflict that's inherent there, and we see it played out in our relationships with our partners too, right? So I learned a lot, and ultimately, quite frankly, what we ended up with was more questions than we had answers for. And so what I've been doing since then is working on new questions. And I want to set the stage for that by talking with you this morning about some foundational ideas that are going to matter. If we're going to get past the conflict of this legacy system of practices based in government power that are exclusionary to a more inclusive approach, a more welcoming approach, to a broader community of support and safety around children, we're going to have to deal with some structural challenges. And so you see my slide here, by the way, this is from Brene Brown. Some of you might like her. But daring leaders are never silent about hard things. And we in child welfare know that. We have to talk about hard things, and so we will talk about them. In fact, I'm going to start this morning by offering you something I was taught by Terry Cross. Terry is the former founding director of the National Indian Child Welfare Association in Portland and now an emeritus director. And Terry is a member of the Seneca Nation from New York State. And in Terry's tradition of the Seneca people, when you have the opportunity, the privilege of speaking to wise people in their culture, you start with an apology. And I'm going to borrow from them because I think I'm going to owe you one when you're not sleeping tonight. But I do want to apologize because I'm going to say some things today that are going to be very hard to hear. But it is not my intention to wound you, but it could be wounding. And I want to apologize for that because it does us no good to wound each other. Right? That's really the opposite of that we want to build each other up, especially in this house. So I want to acknowledge that, but this is going to be difficult in some ways. We'll start with this slide that says our history matters. Theodore Roosevelt said, the more you know about the past, the better prepared you are for the future. And as I said, talked about, I'm jumping in here, but child protection in the Western world is based on a dominant theory of change, historically it's been focused on solving the problems of the poor. This theory it's a 400-year-old theory that comes from Europe, is what we call moving children from bad people and places to better people and places. Children who are at risk being moved to places that are safer is a common sense responsibility as a nation when we are concerned about children as maybe our most important gift. This history, 400-year-old histories, has resulted in a set of exclusionary practices that perpetuate something we call in research casework as usual, that are strategies based in government power. So casework as usual is a term researchers use. I work with researchers around the Western world, and every country I've worked in where I've met researchers and we talk about family engagement practices versus casework as usual. Casework as usual is language that's a shorthand for a way of approaching making decisions in practice that, as it turns out, is ubiquitous in the Western world. And I'm going to tell you the story this morning of why that is. So one of the advantages for me of working outside the United States has been that I learned very quickly that any of us I'm going to be in Belgium in November, assuming that it's safe for them to let me in. And I can tell you, if you practice in Belgium, Dutch is probably said to be one of the hardest languages to master on the planet. if you can speak Dutch, you could easily, within a few weeks, based on your experiences here in Missouri, be a very successful caseworker in the Belgian system. That would be true in the Netherlands. It would be true in England. It would be true in Australia. Be true in France. It's a very consistent pattern of practice, and that's why researchers just simply call it casework as usual. It's a very similar way of making decisions that you didn't invent. It was invented and brought here. As casework as usual, we define who is safe, what is unsafe, who is good, who is bad, who is affluent, who is poor, who is thriving, and who is failing. For Indigenous people here in the United States, in Canada, and Australia, we sometimes have conflicts with Indigenous people around this issue of assimilation. We tend to have difficulty working in Indigenous communities because we look at people who hold on to traditional cultural practices as stubbornly holding on to their past and not embracing our present. This is sort of a part of our history. So what I want to do is give you a brief history of the modern welfare state and the evolution of what became known as casework as usual. Again, another quote here, Edmund Burke, "Those who don't know their history are doomed to repeat it." And I offer this information to you in the top slide I gave you was standing in the place where I can do the most good. What I'm hoping to do is give you information that informs your practice wherever you're placed, for Director Wood, from where you're seated right now, to a family finder, where are you seated right now? Each of us have to make a decision about standing in the place where we can do the most good in the work we're called to do. And I'm hoping to give you information that you can use in your effort to do that. And this history is really critical to understand about our relationships to the public in this system. So I like to tell the story in terms of a pendulum swing. To have a pendulum swing, there need to be two opposite ideas. And we're going to start the first one in 1601. If you went to social work school, and maybe even if you didn't, you probably heard about something called the Elizabethan Poor Laws in 1601. This is in England, it's 1601, which is an extraordinary period in their history of building empire. And by 1601, the English have the largest navy on the planet and are projecting power around the world and colonizing, vast lands. They've already had some people off the coast of both coasts of what become at the time was known as the New World. They've already been to Australia. It's an extraordinary time, and they're really peaking in terms of their history of holding power in the world. But what often the things that we get gifted to us also come at a price. And one of the problems of being the English in 1601 with an exponentially growing empire is that it's growing the problems of poor and indigenous people for them. They have a growing problem. The more land that you take, the more you've got an existing population of people there. You've got a growing population at home, and your problems of dealing with poverty are magnified. And what happens in 1601 is one of those rare times in world history where a major world power turns its full attentions to the problems of poor people. And they have to confront this problem because it's grown exponentially. It's getting too expensive. And as it happens, of course, as they confront this problem, they're going to be shaped by their time. And during this particular time, there's a strong view that has to do with faith, with Christian faith. And they come to a belief that shapes what becomes known in this new merged legislation that becomes law in 1601, known as the Poor Laws. They come to a conclusion about why it is up to 1601 that all of the efforts that the empire has made to deal with the problems of poor people have failed. They're failing, and the problem is growing bigger and bigger, and they're spending more and more money, and it's just not getting better. And they need to do something about it. And they come to a belief, and the belief that is shaped by their time is they come to an understanding that the reason that the problems of poor people have not been made better by their prior efforts is that they've misunderstood what poverty really is. And what they decide that poverty really is an affliction visited upon sinners by God. And what the point being that if we're challenged to, and I mean, if you understand this particular worldview, that people who are poor are suffering the direct consequences from God of their sin, then what you understand is it's not possible for mankind to invent a remedy for poverty because God is inflicting it and we can't overcome that. And so what they decide to do in this legislation is to stop making national investments in the poor, in poor-related services, because there's no reason to do it. It's irrational. What will stop poverty is for people to stop sinning. How's it going, by the way? My church, which is a few blocks away, and I haven't been in 6 months. This is great to be in your church. I've been watching it on TV on Sundays rather than being able to be in our building. But the pastor famously said to me once, I was complaining about somebody and he needed to teach me a lesson. He famously said to me, "Look, Kevin, if you want to find sin, come to my church." You know, that's our truth, right? That's our truth in this church, is that we are all sinners. And the point that the Elizabethan folks are saying is there's no reason to make investments financially in problems of poor people because they cannot be solved but for people to stop sinning. So they set legislation around these ideas, and they hold a number of things, but there are three driving principles to the legislation. The first is that the primary responsibility for the provision for people who are suffering the consequences of poverty belong in their family. And what they're really saying is if an individual will not stop sinning and therefore suffering the consequences of their sin and their children suffering, the people who ought to care most about that are your family members who should love you the most and don't want to see you burn in hell. And so it is up to them in the legislation to go to the family and get the person, as the pastor at my church would say, corrected in the way they live their lives. If the family won't do it, then there still might be hungry kids in the winter who are unsheltered. And as Christians, we can't ignore that. And that responsibility belongs to the local community, to the neighbors. You know, if you see that people are hungry or without shelter, you are called to address their suffering as neighbors. And finally, there's this, that what they decide to do and enact in legislation is to under penalties, restrict the movement of poor people. In other words, you cannot move. And the reason for this is they think that the reason that people who are poor would want to move is to not be known by their neighbors as sinners. And so they want people to be held to account for their sin, and therefore you should stay in the community where you are at until you've gotten right with God, and that will be evidenced by your prosperity. If you do move, the consequence is that when you and your family show up at the next village a couple kilometers down the lane, far enough away where they wouldn't know you, they will recognize you by your condition as sinners. And their responsibility is to beat you and your children every step of the way back to the village you tried to leave. And communities that will not do that face consequences. That is a high-level idea about what the poor laws. What are their relevance to us here in 2020 in Missouri? You have to think about the history of this and the timeline. 1601, right? We've already had visitors from England on the East Coast. We've had ships sail off the West Coast by that point. We've had colonization efforts begin in what becomes later Canada by the French. What it means is that the poor laws are exported here with the founding of America by the English and by the colonization of America. And from our very beginnings, the poor laws are baked into what becomes known as British common law, which is the basis for our legal system today. If you want to see the poor laws play out in America today in the court, the most particular place you would find that is in child welfare. Because what the poor laws are really about, and then we'll move to the other one, is the idea of agency. Who's responsible for the problems of poverty? And during the Elizabethan period, the answer was the poor are responsible for their poverty as sinners. And the law becomes shaped this way. And so, let me give you an example. I several times have had the opportunity to visit Arizona and go to Flagstaff and beyond Flagstaff, including visiting the Navajo reservation in Arizona. I've looked at child welfare matters involving Navajo families. And they won't surprise you because they'll sound like Missouri. It's usually, I know this is shocking, but usually a mom without a dad in the picture. Have you had that case yet? Usually a very young mom, and usually several children. In this case, a Navajo mom and her several children. The reason for the referral will have something to do with severe neglect associated with poverty. There's often substance abuse involved. Does this sound right? And there's family violence with somebody. You know the story? Deplorable housing conditions. Have you had that one? Maybe mental health problems. Sounds very familiar, doesn't it? And you could tell me, just because it'll be just like on the Navajo reservation, what do you think the service plan is about? What's it going to, you know what I'm talking about, the service plan. What are we going to hand up to the court that the parent needs to do in order to get their kids back? What's it going to say? What's that?
Parenting classes.
Parenting classes to improve your ability to parent your children. Yes. What about the housing situation? What are we going to say?
Stable housing.
Stable and safe housing. What about substance use?
The absence of
Be free of substance use and prove that through testing. What about the family violence?
get rid of them.
Yeah, cut them out of the herd. Or as they used to say when I was a kid on TV, wash them out of your hair. You get the picture, right? It makes sense. But the reason I use the Navajo as example, because I think it snaps it into focus in a particular way, is you have to ask yourself, and those cases are heard in the state court, sometimes in the Navajo courts, who's responsible for the fact that there's very little housing stock on the Navajo Nation? That mom? Do you know, for her to get food for her kids, she will probably have to walk to the closest thing resembling a grocery store, which will be a roadside gas mart, and whatever food she can get will be what can be bought there if you have the money to get it. Who's responsible for that? Her? That's the poor laws. The idea of who holds the agency. And the way the juvenile courts are set up in America, we don't ask the question about how come you don't have access to housing. We ask the question, do you have it? We don't ask the question, why don't you have, access to vegetables and fruits for your kids? We just want to know if it's in the refrigerator. Right? That's what we call the poor laws at work. The agency, the responsibility for the consequences of poverty is given to the parent. And, by the way, you're on a timeline, aren't you? And what's the consequences of not meeting the service plan? Of course, the termination of parental rights, and your children get adopted by white folks in Arizona, right? And the dismembering of the Navajo Nation. That's the poor laws at work. That's how it practically plays out in 2020, because it's baked into British common law and reflected in the legislation that's been laid down decade after decade after decade since that time. Does that make sense? It's structural. It really isn't about her. It isn't even about you. It's our legacy. Does that make sense? The point being here, hold on to that idea of agency. Who is responsible for the problems of poor people? The British in 1601 set a precedent for us that says poor people are responsible for their poverty, nobody else. Right? Regardless of the common sense questions it raises, that's the system. The second big evolution, if that's on one end, then we see another swing at another historic time, and again in England, that shapes America's trajectory, much more recent in this case. This is 1947 in Britain again. Now you can know your history a little bit. What's England been doing for 5 years at this point, by 1947, or 7 years? They've been the tip of the spear in the fight against Nazi aggression, and there's nothing more that Hitler would rather do than to wipe them off the face of the planet, and he comes within 48 hours of doing it. And just right after they choose a new prime minister, and once again, this major, at this point, descending world power, empire, the collapse of empire really, is facing an existential threat against the homeland, and it once again turns its full attention to the problems of poor people. And the reason for this is they simply cannot continue to spend treasure on poor relief work that does no one any good, when that money would be better used in building airplanes and fielding an army to protect their survival. And they hire an economist by the name of William Beveridge, who's served as an MP, was elected as a member of government, as an elected official. He is trained, as I said, as an economist. He is a social innovator by reputation. He's also happens to be a eugenicist by his cultural beliefs at the time. And the prime minister hires him to write a report to offer a solution to the country about the problems of poor people. And he releases that report in November of, I believe it was 1947. And it's a rainy November night in London. This report is so anticipated that they sell 100,000 copies of it in just 4 days. This would be an example of going viral before the internet. The report is so in demand, it has to be reprinted 4 times. And oops, you're not seeing the images that I'm seeing on my screen. Can you move the slide? Thank you. I thought I pushed the right button. I pushed the wrong one. These pictures are from the newspapers at the time. And one of the things that Beveridge, who, by the way, is very well regarded in England today, it's about the 75th anniversary, I can't remember, 76th anniversary of the Beveridge report. What he does very masterfully is he tells the story of the crushing poverty in the British Empire at the time by defining them as what he calls the 5 giants, and you can see them on the left. The first giant is the incessant want of things by the poor. If you give poor people relief, they're going to want what, Carrie? You give poor people relief, they want more. It is a bucket with no bottom in it, he says. That fits in our times. We could think about I'm looking at you as a former legislator, and the challenge that legislators face every day in terms of confronting and creating meaningful legislation to confront these problems. And the truth is that more spending on welfare programs has not shown us a big change, has it? And nor had it at the time. It was his point. This is a bucket with no bottom. There's no end to it. The second is that the poor are uneducated often, and which he calls ignorance, but he's really speaking about not having access to education at the time. The English did not have a public education system at the time, and very poor folks were left out of getting education, which left them in want, not able to provide for themselves. Diseased, that the poor by their birth and their class were diseased in mind and spirit, and didn't have access to meaningful health care. And the fourth one, squalor, They choose to live in squalor. If we build public housing, what is the condition of that housing a decade later? Right. He says it's evidence of a choice by the poor to live in substandard housing. And people in the public see these things. They believe these things. Finally, the poor, he says, are without work, are lonely, are lazy. Above all, they're lazy. Did you see the little guy with the sword? That's William Beveridge. And he has something written on his back, which is his solution to this. And you probably can't read it because of the quality of the image. Here's what it says on his back. Casework. He invented you. Here's what he does. He writes a report, and here's what he says. The Elizabethans had it wholly wrong. They said the agency for the problems of poor people belonged to the poor. He said that's wrong. He said, in fact, the poor have no agency at all. By their birth in their class, they have no ability to solve the problems of poor people. What we need is we need to build social service bureaucracies, and we're going to take people of a higher class, whoever you got there, and we're going to build people into case loads. And what we want from case workers is for you to substitute your good judgment and education for their lack of it. So he builds this idea of social welfare bureaucracies. He's your grandfather. He built you. Well, what's he got in his hand there? Because he's not there to rub anybody's shoulders. He wants social workers to end this problem. And he wants systems to end this problem. Does that make sense? The image has power at the time. I think it has power today. The next picture next to it. The poor, the 5 giants, strapped on a bomb. Social workers lighting the fuse and doing the ultimate good for society. This idea that becomes a whole set of initiatives that are very, by the way, valued in the British construct. One of the things in his report, the National Health Service, today, one of the things the British people really appreciate having is the health system they have. It was his idea. Public education, his idea. He had improving housing stock, his idea. But imagine what happened with these ideas when they got here. So what happens is that not only does he sell hundreds of thousands of copies of that report, his next stop after releasing it in the English context is the White House. And he comes to America, and he's a frequent visitor at the White House, and he begins shaping the way that the White House imagines dealing with the problems of poor people. But what do you think happens in the American context when we are giving these images and these ideas? And it's fueled by racism. It's fueled by people's beliefs at the time. People welcome the idea of seeing African Americans as these 5 things, of seeing Native American as these 5 things, of seeing immigrants as these 5 things. Legislators welcome it. They're people of their time. And they construct solutions. And you'll know some of those solutions after the war. We particularly, by the time the Johnson administration arrives, which would be in the 60s after Kennedy's assassination, we see the Great Society programs of Lyndon Johnson, the war on poverty language, what's in his hand? The war on poverty, right? But here's the point of that story. We end up with a legacy today in the American child protection system of both things. On one hand, we continue to have a legal system that says that the agency, the responsibility stops at the parents' feet for their neglect and their conditions and no one else's. And on the other hand, we have evolved a casework as usual model that says that the social worker is responsible for what happens in the family. That the agency, through its contract, is responsible. We end up with a system with a legacy of both experiences. Does that make sense? And we built our practice, and we built our law, and we built our models and our systems around these two core ideas to this day, right? And we, just again, I'm giving you the information individually, decide what you would do with that information. I'm not here to tell you what to do with it. But remember the old saying, which I think has been said in so many different ways: if you don't know your past, you are doomed to repeat it. And we have done it over in one legislative session after another for as long as we've had a democracy. Let's go to the next. Now we move on to a new story. That is the old news. If we could move to the next slide, we did. So I'll set the stage. Our progress. I like Rumi quotes. 4th century mystic. It reminds us there were very wise people on this planet 4,000 years ago in lots of cultures. In this case, a Sufi mystic who said, "Maybe you are searching among the branches for what only appears in the roots." Maybe in your practice, you are searching among the branches for answers that only appear in the roots. That sounds frustrating, doesn't it? Does that sound like the foundation for one failed reform after another for decades? What if it's not an unwillingness to do good for people, but what if it's not knowing quite what that good is? Right, and unpacking that. My interest is we hear this narrative about our system and the people in this system. You all know that narrative. We hear a narrative of brokenness. We see public servants being blamed for that brokenness, who are fighting every day to do the best they can do for people. And we stay in that broken, conflicted sort of narrative for decades. I'm interested in writing new stories, not being trapped in an old one. I happen to view, standing in this building, I happen to have a personal view that you get, as far as I know in my church, you get one life here. And I would consider that life to be a sacred one. And if you chose, Janet, to take this one sacred life God gave you and do this work, then it better mean something. What do you say? Right? I choose to look at the sacredness of the work we do and that we're here for a reason. And I refuse to stay trapped in ignorance from the past, and at least not look around myself at everyone in my present and try to learn something together. Let's explore a new story. And I said our progress leads us to the opportunity for a leap in the quality of justice in our practice. To achieve this, we must stand in new truths and create a new tradition. Stand in the place where you can do the most good is a hint towards a tool I'm going to teach you tomorrow that's called mindful positioning. Is exactly my point. As you approach a young person on your caseload who's in danger, or you approach a parent who is really unwell, or a challenge in your team that night, to try to remember that in an ideal situation, if we imagine using the space around us as a metaphor, that we should have 360 degrees of an opportunity to confront a problem. Why I think that's important is very often in casework as usual, we feel like we have no options but to do the thing we've always done. Right? So what I'm going to be working on is teaching you some strategies in your individual practice and your collective practice for remembering that 360 degrees around you to really pick the place where you can do the most good. Does that make sense? So, but in order to do that, we've got to stand in some bedrock ideas. I'm going to skip that one. So let's come to the 21st century. And the first part of the story I'll tell you is from 2016, and then I'll give you the July 2020 update. So in October of 2016, the American Academy of Pediatrics, which is the largest membership organization of pediatricians in the country and in the world that I know about, in fact, there are slightly more gang members in LA than there are pediatricians in the United States. So it's about 90,000 gang members in LA and about 78,000 pediatricians in the country. And these 78,000 people spend some money to belong to that organization, and they produce a groundbreaking report on the American foster care system that they released in late October of that year. Here are the three big headlines from their research paper. Number one, there is no group of children in America that have worse health conditions and worse mental health conditions and vulnerabilities than children in the American foster care system. Even when we look at the children as a group on the Navajo reservation, or we look at the kids in Compton in Los Angeles, or we look at kids in the lower Ninth Ward in New Orleans, no single group of children in America has worse health conditions than the children on your caseloads in the entire state of Missouri or the rest of the country. They singularly have the worst health and mental health conditions and vulnerabilities of any group of Americans. That's stunning. Probably not a surprise, though. Right? It doesn't surprise you, but it does confirm your wisdom and your experience. Here's the second finding. Of the 437,000 kids who are in that system right now, roughly, it begs the question of those kids, who has the worst health vulnerabilities of all? That turns out to be a surprising answer. The children adopted out of that system. If you want to know which group of children in this entire 73 million kids on this country have the biggest vulnerabilities for future health problems, they will be the children who are adopted out of the American foster care system. It's not what you would think in terms of the story of Adoption Month in November, is it? But it really isn't connected to Adoption Month at all. It has nothing to do with the institution of adoption. It simply has to do with what is different about being a child in the United States who makes that journey from being born in a dangerous circumstance to ultimately being adopted into a family. There's something different about that experience that changes the health trajectories for people. That's really what we're talking about. So in order for those adoptions to happen, you have to make a legal case. You've got to win in a trial, right? The government brings a lawsuit against those parents. Do you know that you are parts of a lawsuit, right? You're an integral part of your practice as part of prosecuting a lawsuit, okay? And we have to win that lawsuit in a trial, or we need to be ready to, right? So the first thing we know is that the children who get adopted out of the system probably as a group got the largest doses of maltreatment and at the earliest parts of life when it would have done the most harm. That makes sense, doesn't it? We know that the majority of these adoptions will be of children under 7. And what we know is that they, by their position, got the biggest doses of harm at the earliest stages of life. That's the first reason why their health is more vulnerable in terms of the future. There's no guarantees of bad health here. There's something we can do about it. But they're in a vulnerable position more so than any other group of children. The second reason the AAP reports this group to be in a vulnerable position is that they stay in foster care 3 times longer than everybody else. So the average length of stay in the U.S. system right now is about 23 months. It's crept up just a bit in the last decade. But these kids, on average, spend 6 years with an open case. And so they get 3 times the dose, here's an example, probably doesn't happen in Missouri, of caseworker changes. You're going to get 3 times the dose of caseworker changes, aren't you? You're going to be exposed to the risks of being involved with the big bureaucracy 3 times longer than everybody else. And there's a better chance that something may happen to you during that time. Does that make sense? And so this explains why the children adopted out of the system will enter their adoptions in a risk position different from other children in the country. No guarantee or certainty that they will face health problems in the future, but it is clear that there's been a change, as we'll learn more about today, in their underlying development. And therefore, it has set their, what we call their life course health trajectories in a different path than it would have been. Does that make sense? And we need to know that, and we need to be thinking about that life course health trajectory. And as we think about the system in the future, we're going to have to think more about the importance of the American healthcare system in changing those stories, something I'm working on with the largest health system in America. The third finding, I thought I saw a hand. It was probably just glare. The third finding, and then I'll move on, is this, that the AAP, in their research, it's 100,000 children, by the way, it's a big N. The AAP wants to look at the foster care experience itself, residential care, the kind of mental health services that are provided to children, caseworkers. And what they do in this study is something researchers call controlling for. So they take a population of these kids and they figure out how much of their altered health trajectories and statuses are the result of early life maltreatment in their first family. And they take that away. And they look at a comparison group of children, presuming they had none of those early life problems and didn't have developmental disabilities, had a typical healthy health trajectory and development trajectory when they entered foster care, and what would happen to them. And here's the finding from that last part of the study, quoting the study, that foster care as a system, that doesn't mean foster parents by themselves, foster care as a system, make its own contribution to distress and disease across the life course. They could find in the evidence that the experience of being in this bureaucracy and developing your brain and body and the way that your genes are going to be read and transcribed is itself going to alter health trajectories and put you at greater risk for negative outcomes. Does that make sense? So that's 100,000 people from this 2016 study. I skipped over this one. This came out July 19th, I believe. Whoops. If you could skip back, go backwards one, please. Sorry. Oh, maybe you're looking at a different deck. Go forward until you see this slide, then. Can you do that? Go one more. There. All right. This is research that came out in mid-July, just less than a month ago. In this case, back again in England. And there are two studies. These are done by King's College and University College London. UCL, it's known as. UCL, University College London, is ranked as in the top 19 research universities in the world. And they undertake two big studies to understand the foster care system and its experiences in the UK. Remember, the UK would be 4 countries: England, Wales, Northern Ireland, and Scotland. And they're looking at the experiences of people in care between 1971 and 2011. The first study that's released, it comes in 2 parts, is on mortality. And the first study involves 365,000 people who were in foster or residential care between 1971 and 2011. And they get their information from the government, and what they do with it is first thing they do is they go to the Census Bureau data. We shockingly got our census from those guys as our cousins, and they've got data tracking every member of the UK every decade for between 1971 and 2011. And they looked for the information on these 365,000 people who had been in care who are dead. And then once they confirm that they died, then they go and get their death certificates to find out when they died and how they died. And the long and the short of it is that if you were in foster care or residential care for any period of time between 1971 and 2011, you were 70% more likely to be dead than if you were not. Okay? That goes up beginning in the year 2000, when policies were undertaken by the British Parliament and the government at the time to begin cutting social safety net programs. And so families become under greater pressure after the year 2000, and that's reflected in the data. The mortality rate goes up after the year 2000 for people in care. Not surprisingly, as I'll teach you a bit about how that works. And here's the really interesting part. We actually would have predicted this, as you'll see later. We could have predicted that there would be an increased mortality rate for this population based on, for example, science that you're familiar with, like adverse childhood experiences. We know that if you've got a score of 6 or higher that's untreated, that you're likely to have a 20-year reduction in lifespan. So it wasn't a surprise to see in the data that the mortality rates were so great. Here was the surprising part. They didn't live long enough to die of those things. They died of unnatural causes, not natural causes. They didn't die of a heart attack. They died of poisoning. Poisoning, in this case, is known as an overdose. They died of suicide. A lot of them died in accidents, and there was a really high percentage of murders. When I reflect on that in the U.S. context, where have we seen data like that? And how have we heard it talked about? It would be in the opiate crisis in the last decade. And you heard the language, deaths of despair. What we see is if you spent any time in foster care or institutional care in the English system between 1971 and 2011, you were at least 3 times more likely to die early. And what would kill you would be an unnatural cause, which really points at what it was like to live after leaving the care system, what life was like, which is where the second study comes in. So the same group then wants to know, well, what do the living have to say? Those who have not succumbed to unnatural deaths, what do they say? And they look at more than 500,000 of them. That's pretty big. And you can see it here. If you spent any time in foster care or residential care between 1971 and 2011, and those who are old enough to have been out of care 30 years, so this is what we call a 30-year look back, those who are still alive, 85% of them say that by the time they've been out of care 30 years, they are in very, very poor health with chronic morbidities in mental illness and physical conditions, heart disease, obesity, cancer, diabetes, other immune-related conditions. When we talk about multimorbidities here, we're talking about 3 or more uncurable conditions. These are chronic or uncurable conditions. 85% of those who spent any time in foster or residential care report by 30 years later to have these chronic conditions. Only, of course, by definition, 15% don't report this. What's interesting is then look at the next data point. What if you were involved with the child welfare system, but you didn't go to foster parents and you didn't go to residential care, you went to relatives? Well, 30 years later, only 42% of them report themselves to be in very, very poor health. So it cuts the risk of living with multimorbidities by half to be raised by relatives rather than to be raised by non-relatives and by professional carers. But then look at the last one. What if you had an investigation and you were left with your parent with services? And what you see is 30 years on, only 21% of these people report being in very, very poor health. By the way, we also have the data for 10 years after leaving care. The people in foster and residential care, 40% in very, very poor health by 10 years leaving care. The kids who stayed with parents, 13% by 10 years leaving care in very, very poor health. So we see a significant reduction in presence of health conditions. Now, I want to use that data to come back to this group you talked about, which is aging out of care. We have a narrative in the United States since about maybe 1995 that began developing, that was a narrative about we should keep older kids in care so they can develop what? skills, right? Not why kids who exit care do so poorly is it might come down to skills. It's actually about poor health. It's actually about complex presentations of developing early onset mental illness, as well as physical health conditions. In fact, we have a National Institute of Health study that shows that by age 26, people who were raised in care systems in the United States by age 26, the majority of them face a health collapse around between 26 and 30. In fact, 50% of them are wholly unemployable by age 26. We can actually predict now in the research, we can predict who that will be by the time they're 5. If you know what exposures to adversities they had up to about their 3rd birthday, even if we went out to 5, if you know which adversities they had, in other words, the composition of those adversities, if you know how many critical and subcritical periods of development occurred while that was happening, you can predict into 4 groups what lives will look like by about age 26. That's, by the way, sounds really upsetting in some ways, but it's actually very exciting, because if I've got a 4 or 5-year-old in front of me and I know what happened to them in the first 3 years of life, I can make a prediction about a health trajectory to age 26. And if I don't like what I see, this is the time to do that intervention, isn't it? Because the system we've had, kids have to sort themselves. It's kind of like that horrible Harry Potter movie and putting your hand in that black cat. Do you remember that? I don't know if anybody ever watched them, but it's sort of like these kids have to show us who's headed to the PTRF or PRTF, is that what you call them? Who's headed to the locked subacute facility, who's headed to the group home, who's headed to the independent living, who's headed to detention, who's headed to the mental health facility. They have to show us that. It's called failing up. We call that failing up, right? You're kind of chasing this kid. But the data actually teaches us that you can predict who's going to go in those directions well before that ever happens. And of course, the advantage of that is if you know how to do that, you can interrupt those trajectories before they happen, right? I got to check the time. We're doing good. Let's go backwards. So what the heck is going on here? What Harvard Center on the Developing Child, Jack Schoenkoff runs the Center on the Developing Child. It was formerly known as the Scientific Council on the Developing Child before Harvard became the home for it. But Schoenkoff and his colleagues says, what is different? We got to articulate what the heck is different about the, remember, we've established from the AAP data and other data in the world, we know that this population that you're caring for is the single most vulnerable group when it comes to health and mental health outcomes across the life course. We know that. In fact, do you have generationally involved families? We actually now understand why we have generationally involved families. It isn't about bad families. It's about health trajectories. We know what that looks like. We know that policy creates generationality and that we can do something. That's good news because we can change policy. If it were about bad families, we'd be praying in here for it because it'd be about all we could do. But the truth is it's actually policy. And if we know and understand how to set policy right, we can do something to disrupt that generationality that we see. But what is it? And it is what Harvard called a unique pileup of adversities. You see, the problem is not simply that children face adversities in Missouri, because the truth is that the majority of children in Missouri faced adversity, right? If we look at the ACEs science, we know that 68%, 69% of Missourians, how do you say, Missourians, is that right? Will admit that they had at least one adverse childhood experience during their childhood. We already know that. We know that adversity in childhood is endemic to American society, as it is in Canada, as it is in England. It's not a criticism of America. It's just part of living in this world is adversity. We all know adversity. That does not explain why it is that these kids are in such a risk position. What is different about them is not that they faced adversity, it is that they faced a pileup of unique adversities, not one of them, but many of them, throughout or at various times in their development, and that each of these types of adversities have particular impacts on the developing brain and body, and even the way our genes are read and transcribed through something called epigenetics. So I'm going to give you 5 that we look at, that we measure. In my practice, we measure 5 adversities, and there's a reason why we do it, because we know from the science that if I understand what you experience, particularly in the first 3 to 5 years of your life, I can be fairly predictive about where that's going to put you by about 26. And by the way, we can even predict where it will put you by age 60. So the advice from the Center on the Developing Child at Harvard for us is, when you meet a kid on your caseload who that safety worry is real for, we're not ignoring that. It has to be thought about. Safety is what I'm talking about, and its consequences. But when you meet that kid, it isn't enough to look at that kid's safety right now and what you're going to do about it. What the best recommendation we've got is, you need to look at that kid and imagine him as a 60-year-old Missourian. Because we can predict that. You can be fairly accurate in making a prediction of a life course outcome for someone up to about what we call the midpoint, which is age 60. And of course, what we want to see is a Missourian, no matter how rough their early start was, who have the health and the well-being and the vitality to really enjoy this democracy, not to be suffering, and quite frankly, sharing their suffering with their neighbors, right? So the advice by the way, for 10 years, the Center on the Developing Child has been saying to us as a field, you see that baby that you've got, you need to be thinking about that baby as a 60-year-old who holds the health and the vitality and the wellness to have lived. Let me borrow some of the University of Missouri, some beautiful work that you might know about, who lived a good life. Do you guys know about the life course health work that they've done for the disabilities community at the University of Missouri that we use in our model at Aetna, at CVS Aetna? Our value as a health insurance company is that our members live a good life, right? Not that they survive their childhood alone, but they survive it in order to live a good life. And we need to be thinking from, remember, stand in the place, where I've been standing looking at a kid and saying, will he make it tonight, or do I need to take him? Which is a critical decision that must be made. It's not enough. There's more to the story than making it through the night. We've got to see that we're contributing towards a life course outcome that's really going to matter to people. If we're ever going to have a public that wants to invest in this system, then we better demonstrate evidence that it's worth investing in. But we also need help to do that. 5 adversity types. First ones, no particular order. The causes of the causes. This is Marmot's work from the Whitehall study originally in England. And Marmot's work results in something known as the social determinants of health. Where you live, where you work, where you learn, and where you play shapes your life course outcomes. We know in US data, if I simply know the zip code that the family is from, I can reasonably predict what will happen with each of those lives. We can predict what will happen educationally. We can predict how much money they will make. We will predict what most of them will die from and when. We've known that for a long time. Public health has powerful data. We know through the social determinants of health experience. By the way, how many rich kids are you guys working with? So the first thing we know is that we know that walking in the door with the parent, the grandparent, and the kids often are 3 generations of people who have experienced something we would call the social determinants of health: food insecurity, housing problems, unemployment, underemployment, violence in the home, addiction in the neighborhood, right? Does this sound familiar? We know that. And we know that will shape health trajectories. It will shape education trajectories unless they're disrupted, right? We know also, though, that these are often, how many of you have met a lonely kid in your caseload? How many have met a lonely mom? And that's terrible. I mean, who wants to admit, as I've had this, a 3-year-old lonely kid? You ever met a lonely 3-year-old in foster care? Separated from their brothers and sisters, don't know when they're going to see their mom next, right? Not in a day program yet, maybe. No little friends. No favorite teacher. Do you know how much 3-year-olds love their teachers? Love their caseworkers? Lonely 3-year-old. So that's sad. It's profoundly sad, but it's actually worse than sad. Here's what we know about staying in a persistent lonely state as a 3-year-old in terms of life course health trajectory impacts. What's been said in the science is by the way, the science done famously by a researcher at the University of Chicago, who branded his work, Loneliness Hurts the Heart, which is a double entendre. It does hurt your heart, but it actually hurts your heart. So what we know about a 3-year-old in a persistently lonely state is the effect on their life course health would be about the equivalent of smoking a pack of cigarettes a day as a 3-year-old. The impact largely being experienced in the cardiovascular system later for an onset of heart disease and other cardiovascular disease, probably looking at least a decade sooner than we would have expected to see it, possibly 3 decades before, right? So loneliness, how many lonely people do you know? How many lonely kids do you know? How many kids that don't know how to have friends do you know? Right? It's an everyday thing for us. It's not a once in a while thing. And that experience itself has life course health implications and mental health implications. So now we've got 2 adversities for a lot of kids you know, don't we? And a lot of moms you know, and a lot of dads you know, and a lot of grandparents you knew. The next one is toxic stress. This is language from Center on the Developing Child. 3 kinds of stress: healthy stress, tolerable stress, toxic stress. Healthy stress. First day of kindergarten. Anybody been there yet? Probably. I don't know if you're doing real kindergarten yet this year. I don't know who cries more at the first day, the kids or you. You. But it's stressful, isn't it? My best example, I've got a 9-year-old. He just turned 9 the other day at home, so it's a fairly recent memory of Finn's first day. But what I remember of 4 kids, we did it 4 times, is pretty grouchy when he got home, really tired, a little bit moody. Do you know that kid? Not himself. Probably for several weeks into the school year, right? Stressful. It's stressful to not be with your mom and dad and your siblings and grandma or Oma at our house, and to deal with all these new kids and to learn a new routine. All of that is stressful. But it's made healthy because Finn is in a strong context of relationships with an Oma who lives next door, who's excited about his first day, with my wife Nicole, who's been preparing that little boy for his whole growing up for this moment. She actually thought it was a good idea to take him to the school to meet the teacher before school started. Anybody do this? Walk around the classroom, pick out your carpet square you get to sleep on. Here's where the toys are. Here's where you hang your backpack. You take some of the anxiety away. Anticipate it. When he comes home and he's not himself, don't be punitive. Hold him. If he wants to be held, hold him. If he wants to run around like a crazy person, let him run around like a crazy person. Make sure he doesn't run into anything and get a corner of our kitchen island in his head. I should have made those round, but I forgot, and he's shown me that several times. You get it. That's healthy stress. And what does healthy stress do? Healthy stress builds strong development. In fact, what we know is it's not actually it's not adversities in childhood that lead by themselves to these negative life course health outcomes. It's not just that, it's the absence of the good things in life, like your brothers and sisters, like your Oma, like staying in your neighborhood, like being really supported to know that your mom's okay, because you're worried about her, because you know how she lives. It's the absence of the good things that makes the bad things so bad in this system, because we know that the way health works is a balancing between everyday good things and bad things. And the ideal, which is called allostasis, is to be tipped slightly towards more good things than bad things on most days, most weeks, and most months. That builds a human being who can thrive in their 60th year. Allostatic load is the reverse, tipped slightly towards negative things rather than positive things each day, each week, each month. And then finally, picturing a teeter-totter with an elephant sitting on one side and a couple of mice on the other are the kids you work with. Allostatic overload, we call that. Do you know what the mice are on this teeter-totter? You and your services. See, we have to understand when we begin to stand in a new place and look at this through the lens of health and look at it through neurobiology, biological sciences, and genomic science, that we need to understand something. There's a wiser question to be answered to the public than do we do good things for people? Because we do good things. You guys do good things for people, don't you? You're proud of the good things that you do, and you should be. But the wiser question when we begin to view this through the lens of health trajectories is not whether we do good things for people. Do you do enough good things to make much of a difference? And what you see in the English science that I showed you around these mortality statistics and the health statistics is not that English social workers don't do good things for people and that English foster parents don't do good things for kids. That's not the point. The point is whatever they did, it wasn't enough of the kind of things that would have changed those health trajectories. And there's no reform for that. You know, look at my personal viewpoint about the Child and Family Services review process. How many of you enjoy that every so often? I almost said a swear word, but I'm in the church, so I'm going to shut up. Here's my take on the Child and Family Services review process from the feds, pounding on the states here, is you need to do more of that stuff and do it harder. You need to count it better. Have you been in these groups? You need to count it better. More specifically, add some new measures, do that a lot harder, spend a bunch more money. How long have we been doing this? How's it working? You see what I'm pointing at, my whole theme today, stand in the place where you can do the most good, and it might not be where the feds tell you to stand. It might be where you have to decide to stand because you care about your neighbors. And that's a disruptive strategy, but I don't see any way to avoid being disruptive here. Let me finish these things. Tolerable stress, severe, repeated, prolonged stressors in childhood, but the experience is buffered by at least one consistent adult in your life who shows affection for you and you have access to. And there's another piece. More than just buffering that stress by being present in your life, they give you control over it. What makes toxic stress toxic is not just that there's a stressor, it's that you feel no sense of control over your life. If you want to make a human being really sick really fast, take their ability to believe that they have any control whatsoever over making their lives better, and you will see somebody get really sick really fast. So it's not just the presence of somebody, you've got to actually feel like you're not a potted plant up on a shelf somewhere. We talked about being an actor in your own life, right? Social workers in the Beveridge model made everyone a potted plant, right? But the truth about powerful social work practice is that you empower people to be actors in their own lives, to build a life worth living, right? Toxic stress is severe, repeated, prolonged stressors without a single adult that you believe loves you, has access to you, and gives you an appropriate level of control over what's happening in your life, even if it's simply the belief it won't always hurt this much. That's called toxic stress. And the problem with toxic stress is it derails healthy development, especially in the first 1,000 days of life. And it's why drug addiction with parents with very young children is so detrimental to kids. We talk about substance exposure, that's dangerous. We certainly don't want kids living in a biohazard, that's dangerous. But it's just simply being left on the bed while the parent's unconscious in the other room and screaming until no one comes. I was involved in a lawsuit on this, and this is not a political statement, it's just something I've been a part of. It was a lawsuit against the Trump administration on behalf of 3 mothers that had their babies taken at the border, 3 infants taken from their moms from Central America. And the advocacy law firm hired me as an expert. Bruce Perry and then a couple colleagues of mine from Seneca Center as the experts in the lawsuit. We won, and we're right now providing restorative services to 7,000 families who were separated, being paid for by the administration in a consent decree agreement. And we won that lawsuit based on the science. And the science that we showed is how globally harmful toxic stress is. And one of the stories that came up in the litigation, I don't know how much you know about these processes, but there's not, the Homeland Security folks don't have an endless budget. They're limited in their resources too, and their staff really did not come into that work expecting to be caring for toddlers and infants. That's not what they were trained to do, but that was their duty. That's what they were ordered to do. And so what would happen is when they separated kids down on the border in Texas or Arizona, for example, they then transfer those kids after 20 days, if they can, into the custody of ACF. And then ACF has providers around the country who would offer care to these kids. And a lot of those providers are in Pennsylvania, Ohio, Massachusetts, New York City, upstate New York. And they don't have a big budget at ICE, so those ICE agents would have to load a government van up with car seats and put toddlers and infants in it, and then drive them from down on the South Texas border to Ohio. And you can imagine the job would be just terribly hard and heartbreaking. I can't imagine it for everyone involved. And then they get to the provider. And the story I want to tell you is what happened with these toddlers after they got to Ohio. This was a report for some of the child care staff who received these kids at the provider agency there. And what they talked about were these toddlers who just would not stop screaming for days. They just screamed, and babies, and they would just scream and scream. And they were just wholly inconsolable for weeks. And then about the time they would start to calm down, they would bring in another loaded kid. And the kid comes in the door and they're not there yet. And they start screaming. As soon as the other kids heard that kid start screaming, they start screaming too. Can you imagine showing up for that job every day? That was their job. And of course you're gonna do everything you can do to console these kids and just do your best with them. But that's the deal. But I tell you that story to point at the science side of this, which is, it's actually what we had to talk about in the lawsuit, in the declarations, was not so much about the screaming. That wasn't, the time you really ought to get worried is when they stop screaming. Because what you knew was that there had been a whole system change in terms of their biology. They had made an adaptation to being in this environment because their bodies knew something their brains would never understand. And that is, if they stayed in that heightened state, they would make themselves really, really sick. And they were getting sick, and it was damaging their bodies and their brains. And their bodies make an adaptation, and that adaptation was to shut it down. Shut down the hormones to a point where they're not in a constant state of fight or flight or freeze, and allow them to be able to deal with this new reality. As bad as it might be, it was better than what their bodies were doing to themselves as they were reacting to being removed from their parents and all this terror that they went through, right? My colleagues and I are now working with those families and those kids who that happened to try to help them get their kids through back what we call developmental catch-up, to get them back on some kind of developmental trajectory, because that is so dangerous. It's not just dangerous in terms of cognition, it's dangerous in terms of heart health, immune system disorder developments, all of these things, right? So a lot of the, how many, have you known kids in your care who don't right now have a consistent, loving adult they expect to be in their life for a lifetime, who they have enough access to be physically close to? Think about COVID-19's impact on visits here. And do you know kids that don't feel any real agency around whether their life is going to get better or not, and they can influence it very much? So the possibility is that we have kids we're working with right now, despite doing all kinds of important things for, that are still hanging toxic stress while we're doing it. But they may not be screaming, but maybe you wish they were. You know, I would always tease people a little bit, but I would always tease social work supervisors whose staff always want to talk about the same 5 kids because they're sitting with them in their cube waiting for a placement. But the ones I wish you would talk about are the ones you never talk about, the ones in what we call the dreaded stable placement. Right? Not dreaded because thank God for foster parents who do this. I mean, right? They're our great partners and we need them. But don't assume just because you got that you've actually changed the trajectory for somebody in a good sense. They might very well be shut down in a way that is not good. Right? That's another adaptation. The body can shut down. Adverse childhood experiences, average ACE score in the study cohorts that I'm working on is 6 to 7. We know that at 6, we know that we have the 5th one here, which is complex developmental trauma. We know that when we get kids to 6 or more adversities, especially, by the way, by age 3, we know by 6 or more adversities, we have about an 80% chance of a developmental disability. Once you get to 9, you're looking at 100% likelihood of at least a learning disability by age 3. We know that. So what would be helpful about knowing how many adversities kids have when they're very little is that we know what to ask the school districts for. Because we know that those kids are going to have learning disabilities, and if we do something about it now, we can really improve their educational achievement. If we pretend that they don't have those learning disabilities until they fail in school, it may be too late to change much about education trajectories, right? So most of the kids I'm working with, when I was doing projects in the world right now, I'm doing them in West Virginia and about to do them I've been doing them in Kansas, and we're going to do some in Kentucky soon. So we're doing them in a distance format. Most of the kids that I see have at least 4 of these adversities, if not all 5 of them, usually by the time they're 3 to 5 years old. And what this helps you understand is what's different about the underlying drivers of the health disparities for the population that you work with is not that they faced adversities, they did. It's that they, relative to other kids in your state, experienced more adversities consecutively over more periods, critical and subcritical periods of development, especially in the first 1,000 days. And it shaped a vulnerability, not a guarantee, but an inherent vulnerability to developing health problems much earlier. Let me summarize that by introducing 2 terms to you that one will sound pretty familiar, the other one may be a little different for you. But the first one's called health span. So we measure 2 things in healthcare. We measure something in population health, we measure something called a health span, and we measure something called a disease span. A health span would be the typical length of time an American adult would live without having at least one chronic incurable disease. Does that make sense? At population, the average health span in America right now is 62.5 years. We would expect typical Americans, on average, to live about 62.5 years, on average, without having a diagnosed chronic incurable condition they have to live with. And then the disease span is how many years do you live with the disease span before you die. And the average is about 13 years. So it gets you to a rough average lifespan in America, which is, when we mix men in there, it really brings down the average, about 78 years, right? So typical person's going to have 62 years without a chronic condition and 13 years or so with one or more. For kids who are raised in the foster care system, their health spans are about 30 years, and their disease spans are about 35 years. You see, that's a way to think about how broad the disparities are when we view this through a health lens. Does that make sense? So we have a tradition in this system, we have a tradition of viewing the children we work with, unless they have an acute, a emergency health condition, or we know they have a chronic disability or disease. We sometimes get them, right? We will care for kids like this. But otherwise, we have a casework community and at-large community in this industry that tends to view health for kids as kind of a certainty, that health just unfolds, right? Kids, I take my own kids to the doctor. We just did their healthy kid checks in August, and it went exactly the way we knew it was going to go. It goes the same way every year. We've been very fortunate that way. We've been very blessed to have kids who are on a developmental trajectory or doing well and have good health. There are a couple of risks in our family. We watch for them. They haven't happened. You know, it's kind of just how it is. But we've tended to look at the population in the child welfare system a lot like that through the lens of caseworkers. Get those healthy kid checks done. Get them to the dentist. Does it sound right to you, Carrie? There's a particular schedule for this, and we treat them as though their health is just going to unfold. There's nothing in the science that says that that's true. Even if they don't present today with a clear presentation around a health condition, it does not mean those vulnerabilities are not present and are not likely to happen. Look at the data from England. By 30 years, by the way, that's 30 years for them out of care would be 30 years for your system out of care. That's age 50. And by age 50, 85% of them look like a really unwell 65-year-old. I tell you this not to depress you, because the truth is that is largely preventable. Those kinds of health outcomes are preventable. But let me start turning the ship here. They're not preventable in a state where the child welfare system are left alone with it. What I'm doing in states, and that's why I'm working as a consultant for CVS Aetna on their child welfare strategy for the country, a disruptive strategy, is we think that the evidence cries out for the American healthcare system to step in and stand shoulder to shoulder with child welfare. That where we've got a caseworker with a caseload, we need the American healthcare system standing right there and actively helping and actively resourcing it. If we can do that, which we're beginning to test right now, we're now the health insurance company for West Virginia. We're the kids in 20,000 kids in West Virginia, about 25,000 kids in Kentucky starting in January. In Arizona, we have plans in other states that we're working to transform. But our whole strategy is this idea that as a health company, it's our responsibility to stand shoulder to shoulder with child welfare. We're not asking child welfare to come get us. We need to come and find you. That's my attitude, right? And we're building it around this science. Let me show you some data. If you could go to the next slide, please. Just before we wrap up, because we're getting to 8 minutes out from your lunch break. There we go. So I don't know if you can see this well. Children in care in California. This is data from 2008 to 2018. As it turns out, I started working in California in 2003 on my research project. It was the first state I worked with after my own. In 2003, when I began working in California, there were 100,000 kids in care. 1 out of every 5 children in foster care in America was from the state of California. You can see by 2019, the state of California is down to 51,219. You can see the data trends from 2008 to 2019, and you notice it's a fairly steep, rapid decline, and then we get pretty much a plateau. There's some bumps in the plateau that represent 2 things. One, the world economic meltdown in 2009, and the other is the opioid crisis between about 2011 and 2017 in California. They had one too. And what you can see, though, is despite the fact that both of those major shocks happened in California, the 5th largest economy in the world, what you can see is the numbers stayed relatively flat during that time. So I'm getting to a point. I just want you to see that. That's California. Here is Pennsylvania, which I began working with in 2007. And you can see that it's like somebody cut the cables in the elevator car, which is never a good thing, and drop those numbers down. And again, remember that this is 2008 to 2019, and Pennsylvania did have a pretty good impact on the opiate crisis. They, especially in western PA and the Alleghenies there that along the border with West Virginia, has been pretty tough. A lot of our research has happened in those counties over there because it was such a particularly challenging place. Last year alone, Pennsylvania reduced the number of kids in care by over 5,000 in 1 year's time. This year will probably match that. Not to be difficult, here's the same data for your state. across the same measurement. Let me explain what is different. What's different about California and Pennsylvania? There are a lot of things different about California and Pennsylvania, including from one another. But in terms of the work that I've done with them and others have done, is that we began with a different outcome in mind. I want to be really clear. I don't think reducing kids in care by itself is an outcome at all. I think you could kill some kids doing that. I think we would agree on that. That is not safety. Simply not having kids in foster care might be simply denying them something that would keep them better than they would have been. I would think we're on the same page there. My interest is not in that. My interest is not in the health of a foster care system. My interest is in the health of a kid who got connected to a child protection system, not just now, but as I said to you, across the life course. It is not so much about doing less foster care that's important. It's what would you do instead of foster care that's important, and especially what would you do instead of institutional care? Because if you look at the data, the institutionalized kids are by far have the worst health outcomes and mental health outcomes of all of the kids you're going to see. But I want to say what I'm working on in California and Pennsylvania with them, it collectively is not about not having kids in foster care. It's about a new word for us, and that word is called healing. Some of you heard me talk a few years ago in Missouri at the Signs of Safety event that I don't know why they invited me to come, but I did. Andrew and I had hung out a little bit, so we've been pushing back on each other for a couple of years at that point. And I said something there that I will say again to you now about safety, and that is simply this, that safety is temporary without healing. So and that comes out of this idea of life course health trajectories, that here's the problem with safety plans. It assumes some things. It assumes that the person you wrote it with has the health and well-being to live it. Number one, I can't make that assumption. And by the way, I can be pretty predictive about that if I know much about their background. I shouldn't act like everybody's the same place. I need to individualize that conversation. But here's the other thing. Because health trajectories unfold over time, for better or for worse, I might very well have somebody who's really compliant right now with the safety plan. It doesn't mean they're going to be in the same place of health or mental health even a year from now or 5 years from now, right? And my whole attitude is that we were going to have to confront some new questions in this, that safety is absolutely critical. By the way, you can't have health without it. You'll be so busy keeping yourself alive from the risk that you'll never get to being better. You'll survive it, probably. Most kids do, fortunately. But it doesn't mean you're not going to pay a price for it the rest of your life. So safety is absolutely critical, and you can't go anywhere without it. But safety isn't enough. That we really have to make a different sort of investment and commitment in terms of policy and practice when it comes to finishing the work, and that work is healing. Now, let me say something about that. There's no way that overburdened state workers are going to be in the healing business. That's not their function, and I don't think it is. I actually, quite frankly, hold a very strong belief that the responsibility for healing belongs to parents, and it belongs to the relatives, and it belongs to the neighbors. My work has been about how do we urgently engage these networks. Very similar to Signs of Safety, Family Finding, we want a network, we want it urgently. But my work with networks is about healing in families. Safety, critical, not enough. And the question that I work with parents on and I work with the relatives on and the school and everybody else is, when they really don't like the lack of safety in a child's life and the way they're living their own lives, my question is very underwhelming, but my question is, are you tired of living this way? For a grandmother, are you tired of living afraid that the next phone call you get is about your daughter's overdose? And what happened to your grandbabies, who you're going to have to say no to because you've got your son's kids in your house? Are you tired of living that way every day? I don't want to be talking about that after it's already happened. I'd like to be talking with her very honestly well before it does happen. Are you tired of living this way? Come to the table because you're tired of living that way. By the way, you may not be able to change your daughter's life. That's not what I ask you to come to the table to do. I ask you to come to the table because you were tired of living the way you're living. Is it just possible by coming to the table that you could invent with your family and the community a better way of living? And what would that mean? How do you define that? And what does the doing of that look like? This afternoon, I know you're going to have your lunch break. This afternoon, I'm going to move out of this kind of conversation into shining a light on a whole series of different practice strategies that you can use to really get there. Let me just finish because I know you have to step away. In our Pennsylvania study right now, being done through the state Supreme Court, who I've been working with for 12 years, we have 14 counties right now in the study across the state. Two new ones. Philadelphia County, which is really big, so we normally do 5 counties, but we only did 2 for this round. But we have 12 active counties who've been working with us for 4 years. These are county child welfare agencies, government agencies, not private agencies, although they work with private provider partners very closely. And here's what's happened. For those 12 counties, they have reduced foster care placements of children by 95%. 2 of the 12 counties have reduced them by 99% without new money, not because of models, because they've changed their practice and the foundation of their practice to focus on families finding healing in their lives. But first, we've got to get to safety. And we do it at the knock on the door. We have that first urgent meeting about family healing within 24 hours of meeting a parent. The majority of kids either stay safely home with the parent and we begin the healing intervention with them and their network right there. And if that can't happen, then they go into kinship care. It is very rare in those counties that they ever go to foster care. Los Angeles County, the single largest child welfare jurisdiction in America right now, Judge Nash is running that project, and he and I just did a talk for Kansas a couple weeks ago virtually with their judges. The average in Los Angeles County right now, they prevent an average of 87.5% of what used to become foster placements for kids. Either kids safely stay with the parent and have a healing intervention, or they go into some kind of kinship care. Hidalgo County, Texas, where right now it's a horrific experience with COVID-19 deaths. And despite that, Judge Villalone has led that project with Texas CASA, 88% of kids. Travis County, which is where Austin is, 87%. I'm going to finish with a difficult statement, but it really is my truth. We've heard a lot in the country and at different places, maybe it's been said here or maybe it hasn't, sometimes in the newspaper, that states are facing a foster care crisis. Have you ever heard that? Kansas's big worries about having kids in hotel rooms and sleeping in the office. I don't know if you've had that ever happen here. But here's my point, my attitude from what I'm learning is we never had a foster care crisis. What we've had is a family engagement crisis. Through our early family finding work, we learned how to catch those cars, but we rarely knew what to do with them. And what our new work is about after you caught the car, what do you do with them? And you can't just talk people out of their problems. You have to understand, when I talk about healing, I'm talking about healing the whole body. We need to understand that most of the healing that actually happens to us happens below our necks. And we've got a system that disembodies everybody and talks to them like everything's a psychological problem, everything's a mental health need. It isn't. In fact, you can't separate the two. And what we're doing in these different places is teaching people how to treat the whole person and the whole family, right? And what we're going to spend time on this afternoon, tomorrow, and then with I guess we've got time specifically with your family finders, is we're going to focus on beginning to give you an orientation to how to treat the whole person, the whole family, and about the idea of not just safety, but how do we facilitate healing. And I'll give you the best evidence I can for that, okay? So we've got a lunch break for 1 hour. Are people on their own, or I didn't ask? All right. Apparently there's what appears to be a free lunch for you. I'm sure it isn't. So enjoy. And it'll be that way, they said. Yeah. All right, thank you. Thank you very much.
All right.